Hey there friends, it's Laurie. Thanks so much for stopping by. Today I'm making 4 fall apple inspired DIYs. Each one would be perfect on a tiered tray, and I did use mostly Dollar Tree supplies. I really hope you enjoy making them with me, so let's get busy. I'm starting my gnome by using a 5-inch pumpkin from the Dollar Tree. I removed the tag and noticed it wasn't standing up perfectly straight and it was kind of leaning to one side. So I used my kitchen knife and I gave the pumpkin a flat bottom. To give the pumpkin a little more stability, I'm using 3 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. Using my glue gun, I attached the 3 sides of the blocks together. Once they were all attached, I then added some hot glue onto the base and then centered my pumpkin. To cover the gnome's body and to make the arms, I'm using 2 of these gray kid socks from the Dollar Tree. So I used my first gray sock and I just slid it up and over the pumpkin. Then to help hold the sock in place, I cut down the center top and then tied it into a knot. To add the beard on my gnome, I'm using a white Dollar Tree bar cloth. In the past, I've used mop strands and pom-poms and I think a few other things. I can't remember offhand, but if you'd like to check out my other gnomes, I'll have that playlist linked below in my description. To hold the beard together, I'm using a white chenille stem. I'm starting at the corner of the bar cloth and I'm cutting off the finished edge. I'm cutting off the bottom trim at 9 inches and the side at 8. When I'm done, I'm then folding that piece of fabric in half and cutting it free. I'm now opening my fabric up and on the folded line, I'm adding a bead of hot glue. And now I'm placing that white chenille stem right on top of it. With that in place, I'm folding the fabric over and pressing it together. Now carefully, while the glue is still hot, I'm sliding each side of the fabric into the center of the chenille stem. Once it's gathered and you're done, it kind of looks like a little skirt. To mimic the hair, I used my scissors and cut thin strips in the fabric. While I was cutting them, I wasn't super fussy, but I did try to keep the strands about the same width. And I cut the 2 pieces of fabric together up until I met the chenille stem. With my beard complete, I'm adding it to the gnome about 2 to 3 inches down from the top, and I'm wrapping the chenille stems around the sides and then twisting them together on the back. I then added some hot glue under the chenille stems to help hold the beard in place. With his beard attached in place, I'm now going to trim it up using my scissors. I cut the 2 sides at an angle and trimmed around the bottom of the beard. My scissors are really sharp, but I did have to work a bit to get through the folded towel. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a wooden bead that I had on hand. It's a medium size, and sometimes I paint them, but I like the natural color, so I'm just going to leave this one as is. To attach it, I'm placing a dot of hot glue in the center of the beard just above the chenille stem and then attaching the bead in place. For my gnome's hat, I'm using a black sock from the men's department at Dollar Tree. I made sure that the heel section on the sock was on the back and then I slipped the sock over the gnome's head. I then pulled each of the sides down next to the beard. To attach the sock to my gnome, I pulled back the fabric over the nose added on a line of hot glue, and then attached the fabric back in place. I'm going to be adding on some arms, so I'm attaching the hat, working my way about an inch or so back from the beard. I added on some hot glue and attached both sides at an angle. To fill out my gnome's hat and give it a little bit of body, I'm using a handful of polyfill. I stuffed it up under the back of the hat and filled out about 4 inches or so. This step is completely optional. You can always just leave the hat as is. To make the gnome's arms, I'm using the second gray sock from the pair. I opened the sock up, I laid it flat and cut directly down the center. The inside of the sock are going to be the outside of my arms because there's a little decorative edge where they had sewn the socks together. When I was done, I then cut off the toe part and left myself about 4 inches of sock. I added a line of hot glue on one side and folded the fabric over. I then added on more hot glue and continued to fold the fabric over, adding hot glue until I rolled the fabric so it looked kind of like an arm. When my first one was complete, I then made my second. As you're rolling the fabric, the ends become uneven, so I ended up cutting them straight off at about the 4-inch mark. To attach them, I pulled up the side of the hat next to the beard and added on some hot glue. I then placed down the arm and pulled the hat over the end. With my first arm in place, I then attached the second. I'm going to have my gnome hold a small apple, and I found one on a fall Dollar Tree pick. I removed it, added some hot glue to the gnome's hand, and pressed it in place. I then added some hot glue to the other hand and pressed it against the apple. To give my gnome some easy feet, I'm using one of the heart-shaped chalkboard tags that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue and then pressed down the gnome. To embellish his hat, I'm using some of this farmhouse ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. They do sell it at Dollar Tree. I couldn't find it at mine, and I'm wrapping it around the gnome's hat and then making a bow. Once I had it the right size, I then trimmed off the tails. I'm adding on a red leaf and a berry pick from the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue where the top of the hat folds over and attached the leaf, and then I added on the berries. And now that I'm done, I'm adding on one more of the small Dollar Tree fall leaves and tucking it up under the red leaf and attaching it in place. To finish up, I'm folding over the end of the sock using the same buffalo check ribbon. I'm tying it off into a simple bow. Now that I'm done, this sweet little gnome holding an apple is ready for my tiered tray. If you're enjoying my video and you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a big thumbs up. And if you're one of my returning friends, you know I'm always so happy to see you. I'm starting my fresh apples tree by using 8 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. Using my glue gun, I'm attaching them together to make a small box. I attached 4 of them together on their sides using my glue gun. With my first layer complete, I'm now adding on my second. Now that the base is complete, I'm recycling an old piece of Sahara floral block that I had originally picked up at the Dollar Tree. I placed my base down on top of it and then, using a knife, I marked out the inside area. When I was done, I then cut out the rectangle. I trimmed off the edges a bit and then slipped it into the base. With both of my pieces attached together, I'm now using some of my sage green acrylic paint and giving it a complete coat. While I was painting it, I did paint over the Sahara floral as well. To attach on my sign, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree chalkboard wood stakes. I used my clippers and I just clipped it free from the stake. Now to add the words fresh apples, you can always just write on the chalkboard tag. I used my Cricut and printed out the word fresh apples. And then I just attached it onto the sign. Using my hot glue gun, I then attached it to the front of the base. To make my apple tree, I'm using a leftover flower stem. It had originally held flowers and I just saved the stem after I used them for another project. To make the apples, I found this beaded pumpkin at the Dollar Tree and I'm going to cut one side off and slip off the beads. You can use as many beads as you'd like. I'm going to use 13 for my project. To paint my beads, I'm first slipping them on to a piece of floral wire. Once they're all in place, I'm then using some red acrylic paint and giving them a complete coat. You can find some small pre-made apples at craft stores. I needed a hole on the bottom of some of my apples, so that's why I'm making mine out of beads. Once they're completely dry, I then slip them off of the wire. For the leaf accents, I have bags and bags of them that are left over from past projects where I used the flowers and I didn't need the leaves. So I went through and I found some little stems and some leaves that I'm going to use for my tree. I cut off one of the stems and I slipped it up through the bead and then trimmed off both the ends. If your leaf doesn't fit snugly inside, just add a little bit of glue to help hold it in place. If you don't have something like this on hand, you can always cut a thin strip out of a leaf and then just follow the same instructions. After I made my first apple, I just continued on and made 12 more. To add on my apples, this tree has some small branches sticking out on the sides, so using my E6000, I'm just adding a little to the end and slipping on an apple. If you don't have little branches on your cut flower stem, not to worry, because I'll be adding those apples next. After I had my apples attached to the branches, I then used my glue gun along with some E6000 and started to add them randomly around the tree. The reason I used hot glue and E6000 is the hot glue will let me attach them in place, and then the E6000, once it sets up, will make sure that they don't move. To add on my leaves and green accent, I'm cutting little pieces of the leaves off of this stem. And when I'm done, I'll have a whole little pile of leaves. To attach the leaves, because they are so much lighter than the apples, I'm only using my E6000. And once again, I'm just kind of placing them here and there and filling out the tree. If you'd like to make a fall tree instead of an apple tree, you can always just omit the apples and add on some multicolored leaves. Once I had all the leaves in place, I then set the tree aside and let it set up for about 2 or 3 hours. When my tree was completely set up, adding it to the fresh apples base was super easy. I just pressed it down in the center. To hide the Sahara foam, I'm using a small amount of the Dollar Tree reindeer moss. I added on some hot glue and then a few pinches of the moss. With that in place, I'm now taking the 3 apples that I had left over, and because the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, I'm placing them right around it. Now that I'm done, this super cute apple tree makes the perfect addition to my tiered tray. To make my sweet cider house, I'm using one of the small wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I'm then using my white acrylic paint and I'm giving it a complete coat. With my house dry, I want to give the edges a bit of a smoky accent, so I'm using a pencil. I'm sketching along the outside edge of the house and then just kind of rubbing it in with my finger. Adding on this accent is completely optional. It's just personal preference, and if you would prefer a bright white house, just omit this step. I'm adding a roof onto my house, but this step is completely optional. I'm using 3 of the wooden clothespins from the Dollar Tree. I'm turning them into the roof, and I need 6 individual pieces, so I'm pulling them all apart. I'm attaching 2 sets of 3 together, and I'm using my Starbond thick glue, which I love because it sets up wood projects super quick. And all I'm doing is adding some to the side of each clothespin and attaching them together. While you're attaching them, you will see that there's a little line, and that's where the metal support was, so that makes it easy for you to line them up. Now when I'm placing these down on the house, there's a little hole that will show up, and that's where they were attached together. So I'm going to use one of the skewers from the Dollar Tree to fill in the hole. I cut 2 short pieces of skewer to fit in the length of the holes. I then added in my Starbond thick glue, placed in the skewers, and then tapped them into place. The Starbond thick glue sets up super quick, usually within 2 to 3 minutes. And if you would like to try this glue out, I do have the company linked below in my description. Now that they're set up, you can see there's a little overhang on the sides and a little bit on the top, so I'm going to use my heavy grit paper and just kind of sand them down a bit. Now that the edges and the tops of my roof are smooth, I'm going to give them a coat of red acrylic paint. And I did make sure to paint both the top and the bottom. With my 2 roof pieces dry, I'm adding them to the house by placing some hot glue on the top of the form. I then attach the pieces flat side down with the flat ends pointing to the peak of the roof. I also made sure that while I was attaching them, they both were centered. For the apple accent on my house, I'm using one of these wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree. And then once again, to match the roof, I'm using the same red acrylic paint and giving it a coat. When I was done with the apple, I then used some dark green acrylic paint and painted the leaves, and I'm actually going to be covering these, but just in case it would show through, I figured I'd give it a coat. So just like I added the accent on the house, I'm once again using my pencil and accenting the apple. I'm rubbing the edge of the pencil around the outside of the apple and then rubbing it in with my finger. And once again, this step is completely optional. To add on the wording Sweet Cider House, I printed it out on my Cricut and added it to the apple. And if you don't have a Cricut, you can always use some of the sticker letters. I saw a huge assortment of really cool ones at Michael's. They come in different styles and colors, so you could always use those instead. To add the apple onto my house, I'm just adding on some hot glue and then centering it in the middle. Before the hot glue dries that has popped through the little hanger hole, I'm adding on a silk leaf and I'm just folding it in half and placing it onto the apple. I'm adding on a ribbon accent to my house and I'm using this black and white check that I picked up at Michael's. I wrapped it around the house to get my size, I cut it, and then I hot glued it into place. For the bow accent, I'm using some black and white gingham ribbon, and then I'm just making a simple bow. When I was done, I then cut both tails at the same length at an angle. To attach it, I added some hot glue onto the leaf, and then attached my bow in place. And with that, this Sweet Cider House is the perfect addition to my tiered tray. To make my canning lid apples, I'm actually recycling 2 lids I had left over from past preserves. I'm making 2 different size apples, so I'm using a large one and a small one. I also recycled 3 canning lids and turned them into a pumpkin in a past video, and I'll have that linked below in case you'd like to check it out. To help make them stand up, I'm using 4 tumbling tower blocks, 3 that are the regular size, and then 1 that's just a bit shorter so it will fit behind the smaller apple. I used my glue gun and I attached and stacked the 3 tumbling tower blocks. I added some hot glue onto the side and then attached it to the back of my canning jar lid. For the smaller apple, I'm using the shorter tumbling tower block and I'm attaching that to the back. I'm then attaching the smaller apple to the larger by adding some hot glue onto the back of the block and then slightly offsetting it against the larger apple. To turn my apples red, I'm using some of this apple red spray paint and I'm giving both the front and the back a complete coat. Now that it's painted, sometimes the paint will scratch off of the metal, so what I like to do is give it a coat of Mod Podge, and that kind of seals it on a little more permanent. So using my paintbrush, I'm just giving the front and the back a complete coat. I let it dry completely, and now I'm going to add on the apple stems, And believe it or not, I have an apple tree in my yard and it dropped this branch, so I used my cutters and cut off 2 apple stems. Along with my glue gun, I'm using some E6000 to help hold the stems in place. I'm adding some hot glue to the back of my large apple and then following it up with the E6000, and once again, the hot glue will hold the stem in place and the E6000 will make sure it doesn't move once it sets up. With the larger apple complete, I then followed the same instructions and attached the stem to the smaller one. Now that they've set up for a couple of hours, it's time to add on the leaves. I'm actually using 1 leaf from my stash and I'm cutting it into 3 pieces. I'm starting with the smaller apple, adding some hot glue to the back stem, and then attaching on the leaf. For my larger apple, I added a little hot glue to the front of the stem and attached the leaf, and then I added some more hot glue to the back of the stem and attached my second leaf. I'm giving both of my apples an accent, and I'm using this pretty black and white check ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. I made 2 simple bows the same size and cut about 2-inch tails. When I was done, I then used my glue gun and attached one to the front of each stem. And with that, my canning lid apples are complete and ready to display. I hope you had fun making these apple-inspired DIYs with me. And if you're new to my channel and you're thinking, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I will see you all very soon. Bye, everybody!